comes to movie tie-in games, playing the film is one thing and that's fine, but games that dare to add to the setting, allowing us to play unseen moments and get to know characters better, are always more exciting. After all, video games are a viable place to tell a story, so why waste that by just showing us a more pixelated version of what we watched in the cinema? Where did that character go? Where is that symbol from? What happened next? The video games in this list dare to answer big questions that their movies simply didn't, and in so doing made themselves a worthy contribution to the story. I'm Si for WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 video games that answer major movie questions. Number 10. Chronicles of Riddick: Escape from Butcher Bay. How did Riddick get his eye shine? The general consensus on sci-fi horror Pitch Black was mixed, but the film's anti-hero figure Riddick really stood out as ineffably cool. More than this, Vin Diesel was a fresh prospect at the time, and Pitch Black would be the beginning of his breakout success. Diesel, ever the fan of gaming, wanted to do a lot more with his character, and so had a hand in the development of Chronicles of Riddick: Escape from Butcher Bay, which released in the same year as the sequel film for Xbox and PC. In Pitch Black, Riddick is an escaped convict who makes several references to growing up in prison and gives a cryptic anecdote about his eyeshine powers, which allow him to see in the dark. Audiences are left to wonder the full truth of this, and Escape from Butcher Bay acts as a literal flashback to these events, seeing Riddick's attempts to escape and stumbling into his newfound abilities. After scrabbling in the dark, the convict visits Papa Joe to fix up an injury to his arm. It's here that we learn that Riddick's eyeshine surgery was unplanned, with Joe doing it whilst Riddick was unconscious. The Chronicles of Riddick sequel films that followed Pitch Black were critical failures. However, Escape from Butcher Bay is remembered quite fondly as a visually appealing game with an exciting blend of action and stealth that leads into Pitch Black wonderfully. Number 9. The Amazing Spider-Man. What happened to Dr. Connors? Insomniac Games have given the Spider-Man IP a new lease on life in the video game space in the last few years, but people sleep on the more interesting parts of the Amazing Spider-Man games. Instead of adapting the 2012 film itself into a video game, developers Beanox went the interesting route of essentially making the tie-in a storyline sequel. Whereas The Amazing Spider-Man 2, which would arrive in cinemas 2 years later, jumped ahead to follow Peter Parker's journey, it left out the fate of the incarcerated villain of the first movie, Dr. Connors. So, what happened to him? This video game sequel does what the film sequel doesn't, and looks at the immediate realities in the wake of Dr. Connors' reign of terror at the end of the film. With Oscorp reeling, the game introduces Alistair Smythe, before his eventual on-screen appearance, who opens the story by detailing that the business is choosing to terminate its cross-species experiments. Naturally, a mass breakout occurs, and Spider-Man is then forced to team up with his brilliant lizard-brain former adversary. Of course, this game and The Amazing Spider-Man 2 sadly don't match up at all, and thus this has to be considered non-canon. However, as an insight into what happened next to Kirk Connors, it's a cool approach to a video game tie-in. Number 8. Wanted: Weapons of Fate. Who is Wesley's mother? Whilst certain members of the team behind 2008 action film The Wanted seemed confident that the picture would get a sequel, to this day it still hasn't happened. However, the story does continue in Wanted: Weapons of Fate, which was released less than a year later for PS3 and 360. The motion picture setup was everyday office worker Wesley discovering that his estranged father held court with the Fraternity, a shadowy cabal of assassins. However, answering questions about his dad only raises more about his family heritage. What about his mother? Weapons of Fate chooses to address this. Weapons of Fate features flashbacks to the past to better flesh out the story. The game's villain, the Immortal, is the leader of the French faction of the group and is intrinsically tied to Wesley's family. Not only do we see his father's previous clashes with the figure, but that the Immortal is shown to be responsible for the death of Wesley's mother. However, in much the same way the film has a big reveal, Weapons of Fate twists itself on its head late into the game with major ramifications. Not only does the game help to complete the cycle of why Wesley never knew his parents in the first place, it makes sure you can't look at the film the same way again. Number 7. Back to the Future the video game. How did Marty and Emmett first meet? Sequels to films, be they movies themselves or in this case video games, obviously tend to answer the very standard but often intriguing question of what happened next. Back to the Future the video game, released in 2010, manages to answer what is next and also what is previous. Time travel is fun like that. One major question from the Back to the Future movie trilogy that was never answered on screen was just how a teenage Marty McFly even became friends with eccentric scientist Emmett Brown. I mean, let's face it, it's a little odd. Whilst the video game doesn't show Marty's first encounter with the Doc, it does show Doc's first encounter with Marty. Again, time travel, bizarre. The game, which takes place after the films, takes Marty from 1985 to 1931, where he must persuade the young Emmett Brown to abandon his father's plans for him to become a lawyer and instead pursue his passion for science. Otherwise, the entire events leading up to the original movie cease to happen. The adventure, in traditional Back to the Future fashion, gets infinitely more complex with a butterfly effect style series of errors caused by Doc and Marty's attempts to fix the time-space continuum. But when you think about it in a straight line, it shows the first time Doc met Marty, and he just didn't know about it. Number 6. Aliens, Colonial Marines. Is Hicks really dead? Amongst the last decade of Alien video game spin-offs, there have been several that play into the film franchise's lore and do some interesting things. Alien Isolation, Creative Assembly's interquill survival horror title, jumps off from a deleted scene from 1986's Aliens that shows the deceased daughter of Ellen Ripley. The game, in a stroke of genius, puts the player in the space boots of Amanda Ripley searching for her missing mother. It's perhaps Colonial Marines, however, that provides a more surprising change to canon. Despite being a detestable and infamously bug-laden mistake of a video game, it at least undoes a reviled move that the films made. Alien 3 begins with the shocking off-screen deaths of several major characters from the preceding film, chief among them Ripley's surrogate daughter Newt and the beloved Corporal Hicks, a decision that confused and infuriated fans for decades. Colonial Marines, in its DLC chapter, Stasis Interrupted, reintroduces Hicks after he's been held by Weyland-Yutani for months. Apparently, he was awoken from cryosleep between Aliens and Alien 3 by soldiers, and in an ensuing scuffle, one of the men who disturbed his long sleep wound up in his pod, explaining the body found when the ship crashed. Colonial Marines is debatably canon, but either way, many fans will take this course correction of the beloved Hicks over Alien 3's unceremonious and unfair death, especially since Michael Biehn returned to reprise the role. Number 5. Ghostbusters the video game. Where does the River of Slime come from? With 2 decades of will they won't they surrounding the Ghostbusters returning for another sequel, it seemed that Atari's 2009 video game was one way for the cast to deliver a new story without actually having to go to the effort of being on location. With Murray, Aykroyd, Ramis, Hudson and more returning, it was for all intents and purposes Ghostbusters 3 before Afterlife was even a twinkle in the eye of Jason Reitman. The events of 1989's Ghostbusters 2 features gallons of pink slime lurking under the city that is feeding on the negative emotions of 16 million New Yorkers. Whilst the slime flows towards the Museum of Art, where the painting of Vigo the Carpathian resides, the very valid question of where is it flowing from is never addressed. In Ghostbusters the video game, the boys in grey explore a castle that rises out of the Hudson River where Ivo Shandor, the man who built the Gozerian temple in the first film, had resided. Here his cult had pulled a ghost called a Slaw into our world. Shandor converted and pumped the slime it created into the tunnels of New York, hoping to utilise its spiritual powers to bring forth Gozer. However, with Gozer defeated in the first film, the slime remained for Vigo to take advantage of. As any good third-part story should, the video game managed to tie the 2 separate stories of Ghostbusters and Ghostbusters 2 together in a surprisingly satisfying way. Number 4. Star Wars The Force Unleashed. Where did the Alliance logo come from? The Star Wars universe is beloved because of its depth. Even the most fantastical fictional worlds can be made to feel realistic if there's the right amount of detail to them, crafting histories to its characters, locations and organisations. Star Wars is obviously lore-wise deep and complex and is rife with recognisable iconography. The Alliance Starbird, as it is sometimes known, adorns rebel ships, helmets and more. But why that symbol? It was a logo without a backstory for a long time. It turns out that Star Wars The Force Unleashed, the celebrated 2008 adventure title, had the answer for it. The game, which takes place between episode 3 and 4, has multiple endings. The good ending sees protagonist Starkiller, aka Galen Marek, choosing to side with the Jedi over the Sith, sacrificing himself to save General Kota. As Starkiller dies, Vader and Palpatine muse that this decision will likely make the former apprentice a martyr for the Rebel Alliance. Sure enough, the next scene shows Princess Leia uncovering the Marek family crest and honouring the player's sacrifice by adopting it for the Rebel Alliance moving forward. Whilst Disney did away with a lot of Star Wars canon when they began work on the sequel trilogy, changing the origin of this logo to something all the more regular and boring, this is one awesome revelation that Force Unleashed players won't forget. Number 3. Evil Dead, Hail to the King. What happened to Ash's severed hand? The bloodbath insanity of the B-movie Evil Dead horror series is awesome because it makes you ask weird questions like, whatever happened to the severed hand? Famously, during the events of Evil Dead 2, protagonist Ash Williams is forced to remove his own hand that has become possessed thanks to the curse of the Necronomicon. This is what leads to his mounting of a chainsaw onto his wrist. Whilst the hand returns at the end of the film, it's never outright shown to be destroyed. So, where did it go? Did it just lurk in the cabin forevermore? It turns out, yes, to a certain point. Evil Dead Hail to the King, the 1992 PS1 and Dreamcast game, is set 8 years after the events of the films and features Ash returning to the cabin to face his reoccurring nightmares about the Necronomicon. Upon his arrival, the severed hand comes out of hiding to put into motion a series of events that sets up the plot and gives the player a reason to clash with the Deadites. Ash's severed hand has become such an interestingly comical part of the Evil Dead franchise that the TV show Ash vs Evil Dead addressed it years later, but in the early 1990s, it was nice to see it crop back up again to cause more mayhem. Number 2. Enter the Matrix. Why does the Oracle look different? With the success of the Wachowskis' original Matrix picture, the concept blossomed into a fully fledged franchise that included sequels, spin-offs, and video games. The Matrix Reloaded and Revolutions were filmed concurrently, as were additional scenes that were written and directed specifically for a video game. Enter the Matrix released in May 2003, the same month as The Matrix Reloaded, because its story was so tied to the film. If you ever wondered where Niobe and Ghost came from to save Morpheus during Reloaded's highway chase scene, Enter the Matrix has the answer. With those two characters at the forefront, it weaves around the story of the movie, fleshing out backstories and running alongside Neo's quest for the Keymaker in the film. Being that it has around an hour of exclusive live-action footage featuring the actors themselves, it's no wonder that Enter the Matrix is chock full of important details. One particularly prudent one is a story given from the Oracle. Due to the passing of the original actress, Gloria Foster, and subsequent recasting by Mary Alice, she explains that she had her favourite shell deleted by the Merovingian, the secondary antagonist of Reloaded. Whilst the game has sadly never been ported forwards, the story pieces of Enter the Matrix were so integral that they were included as bonus content in later Matrix DVD releases. Number 1. The Thing. Are Mac or Childs the Thing? John Carpenter's The Thing is an all-time horror classic that defined the genre of body horror and has had an immense impact on both cinema and video games. Centering on the discovery of an alien that can perfectly imitate any living organism, the movie is all about paranoia. The Thing ends with RJ McCready and his short-tempered colleague Childs left alone in the Antarctic. It's the ambiguous ending to end all ambiguous endings. Neither of them can be sure that the other isn't the Thing, and if they're both human, they'll most likely freeze to death waiting to find out. However, the 2002 PS2 title follows on from these events and as such has to address the mystery. The player takes the role of Captain Blake, part of an American team who arrive at Outpost 31 shortly after the film's climax. It immediately sets the story straight for Childs, who has died of hypothermia, but the fate of Mac is left dangling and tantalises players to explore more. In the game's final act, the player is assisted by a not-so-mysterious helicopter pilot who, after helping to dispatch the final boss, reveals himself to be a surviving RJ McCready. Whilst on the surface this feels like a happier ending, who's to say that a McCready thing didn't just save Blake so that he could kill him later? You never know, which is kind of the whole point. And that's the list. Let us know what you thought of this video down in the comments below. Were any of these pieces of additional information for your favourite movies a revelation? And of course, let us know of any other video game movie tie-ins that really fleshed out a story. Make sure you like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe and hit that notification bell. I've been Cy for WhatCulture, and have a good week.